The USS Arleigh Burke, one of the most advanced destroyers in the U.S. Navy fleet, sat moored at Naval Base Kitsap, her sleek gray hull glistening in the early morning mist. Just 72 hours before a critical Pacific deployment, the base was a hive of frantic activity. Technicians, engineers, and command officers moved through the hangars and control rooms with growing urgency, but no one was speaking with confidence anymore. The engine had failed. Not partially. Not intermittently. Completely. The LM-2500 gas turbine, the very heart of the destroyer's propulsion system, shut down mid-test during a routine systems drill. And no one could explain why. Inside the ship's intermediate maintenance facility, the massive reinforced hangar that echoed with hydraulic hisses and metallic clinks, the mood had turned from tense to near panic. 5 teams of engineers had already cycled through the diagnostic. Every sensor was checked, every line of software reviewed. They had recalibrated fuel injectors, replaced filters, swapped out entire control units, but the engine still lost power exactly 90 seconds into each test run. At the command center, Admiral James Lawson stood beside a projection screen filled with readouts and schematic. His arms were crossed, lips drawn into a hard line. A man in his early 60s with close-cropped silver hair and the sharp eyes of someone who had seen combat, Lawson wasn't prone to fear. But this was something different, something deeper than mechanical failure. This destroyer was scheduled to lead a carrier strike group on a high-security mission, an unannounced deployment across disputed waters. And now, 3 days before launch, the ship was dead in the water. He turned to the lead systems analyst, Chief Engineer Watkins, a tall, square-shouldered man with tightly combed gray hair and a degree from MIT. "Status?" Lawson asked, voice clipped. Watkins shook his head and looked away from the screen. "No improvement. All system tests passed individually. But once the turbines underload, we lose pressure across the second compression stage. Every time. You're telling me you've thrown 5 engineering teams and a $10 million diagnostics suite at this problem, and the best we've got is a shrug? There's no data pointing to a mechanical failure, sir. Not conclusively." Lawson stepped back, inhaling deeply through his nose. The room felt heavier than it should, like the walls themselves were pressing in. The mission had been in the works for 8 months. A delay could mean exposing the Navy's intentions or worse, handing the adversary a tactical advantage before they even deployed. "I want every sensor rechecked, every seal inspected, and every turbine blade measured. Manually if needed. I don't care how many hours it takes," he barked. Watkins nodded and turned back to his team. But behind the Admiral's back, another officer leaned toward Watkins and murmured, just loud enough to be heard, "Maybe it's time we call Clark." Watkins froze. His fingers hovered over the tablet in his hand. "You're joking," he said without turning. "That man hasn't been in the Navy for 2 decades. He doesn't even hold active clearance." The junior officer didn't smile. "But he knows those engines better than anyone else." Lawson heard it too. "Clark," he said, turning back around slowly. "You're talking about Brandon Clark?" "Yes, sir. He was part of the prototype engineering team back when the LM-2500s were first integrated into the Burke-class hulls." "I know who he is," Lawson snapped, though his voice had softened just slightly. His eyes drifted for a moment. "I haven't heard that name in years." Another silence fell over the room, this one different. Almost reverent. Clark had been a legend once. A machinery officer with instincts no algorithm could match. But his fall had been sharp. 2 decades ago, a routine drill turned into a disaster, and Clark took the blame. He was discharged quietly, without trial or public record. Since then, his name had faded into obscurity, like an oil stain washed away by time. Lawson stared at the screen again. The engine diagram pulsed with blinking errors. "Get me his file," he said finally, "and see if his old clearance can be reactivated." Watkins opened his mouth to protest, but stopped himself. There was something in the Admiral's tone, a blend of desperation and authority that left no room for debate. Across the bay, as the sun began to burn off the morning haze, the USS Arleigh Burke remained eerily silent. Her mighty frame sat idle, the engine inside her massive hull waiting for someone, anyone, who could bring it back to life. Far away from the base, in a cluttered workshop that smelled of grease and salt, a brass rod lay on a wooden table, dented, old, and forgotten. But not for long. Nestled on the quiet edge of Tracy Bay, where the sea whispered against driftwood and seagulls flew low over tide-worn docks, stood a small, weathered shed. From the outside, it looked like any other marine workshop: corrugated steel walls, faded signage, and a rusting fuel tank out back. But inside, among the stacks of engine parts and tools hanging from old nails, lived a man once known as one of the finest machinery officers the Navy had ever trained. Brandon Clark, 72 years old, stood over an open motor from a shrimp boat engine. His hands, still steady despite the years, moved with quiet precision. He wore dark blue coveralls stained with grease and salt, and a pencil was tucked behind his ear. A small, battered radio on the shelf played a crackling old jazz tune, just like it did every morning at 6 a.m., without fail. He didn't need an alarm. The rhythm of the coast, the call of the gulls, and the sound of tools clinking on metal were enough to start his day. Brandon wasn't just fixing engines, he was communing with them. Listening, adjusting, restoring life to what others would consider scrap. He didn't have a formal shop front, no website or business cards, and yet, his phone rang regularly. Local fishermen, small ferry operators, even young apprentice mechanics sought him out. But none of them really knew who he used to be. As a boy, Brandon had been different. While other kids played ball in the schoolyard, he was in the junkyard behind the school, digging through broken radios and rusted lawnmower parts. He rebuilt his first small engine at age 9. By 11, he was repairing generators for neighbors. No one taught him, not really. He just seemed to understand machines the way others understood music or math. At 19, he enlisted in the Navy and quickly distinguished himself as a technical prodigy. His superiors noticed how he could identify issues no system could flag, just by listening to the pitch of a turbine or feeling the vibration of a crankshaft through his fingers. By the time he was 35, he was stationed on advanced vessels, consulted on aircraft carrier propulsion, and eventually helped design the early LM-2500 engines used in the first Arleigh Burke-class destroyers. His most notable achievement was an engine optimization process that reduced failure rates during high-speed maneuvers by nearly 40%. He never filed a patent, never sought attention, just did the work. But it all came crashing down. During a routine drill in the South Pacific, Brandon's ship reported a critical engine failure. A sensor flagged a pressure drop, and before it could be corrected, the system shut down. A formal investigation followed. Brandon, who had been on duty, raised concerns about faulty installation procedures on a new software patch, but those concerns were buried. The Navy needed a scapegoat. They blamed him for not catching the problem during pre-check. Ignored his defense. No hearing. No chance to clear his name. Just a sealed report, a quietly delivered retirement package, and a letter thanking him for years of honorable service. He was 52. And just like that, his career was gone. Brandon never publicly protested. He knew how the system worked. The truth wouldn't matter once the Navy had made up its mind. So, he packed what was left of his tools, left the base, and returned to the coast where he grew up. Over the years, the world changed. Ships got smarter, diagnostics more digital, but Brandon remained the same. He never owned a smartphone. Still kept records in a spiral notebook. Still used a brass listening rod to hear the language of machines. Inside his workshop, photos hung above the workbench. One showed a much younger Brandon in navy blues, standing in front of a destroyer with a proud smile. Another showed him holding a wrench, surrounded by junior sailors laughing. Those days were long gone, but he hadn't taken the photos down. He didn't speak much about the past, not even when the young mechanics asked. But sometimes, when he was alone, and the wind howled just right through the broken window frame, he'd look up at those photos and remember who he had been. That Tuesday afternoon, he was elbow-deep in an old diesel engine when his phone buzzed. Unknown number. Brandon wiped his hands on a rag, leaving darker smears where the grease was already thick. He picked up. Clark speaking. The voice on the other end paused, then said, "Brandon Clark. This is Admiral Jim Lawson, Pacific Naval Engineering Command." Brandon frowned, staring at the silent motor before him. That name. It had been a long time. "I didn't think I'd ever hear from you again, Jim." "Neither did I," Lawson replied. "But we've got a serious problem. We need your help." "It's the Arleigh Burke." Brandon's face hardened. "You're calling me to fix a ship I was practically exiled for?" "Because no one else can," Lawson said. "You know that engine better than anyone." A long silence stretched across the line. Then Brandon said simply, "Send a car." And he hung up. The phone call lingered in Brandon's mind long after it ended. He stood motionless in his workshop for several minutes, the receiver still in his hand, as if the voice of Admiral Lawson might return with more explanation. But the line was dead. All that remained was the faint crackle of static and the rhythmic tapping of rain against the workshop roof. He stared at the engine he'd been working on, a two-stroke outboard for an old crab boat, then gently lowered the wrench and reached for the rag draped over his shoulder. He wiped his hands slowly, methodically, as if cleaning off more than just oil and grime. Brandon hadn't stepped foot on a naval base in 20 years. And yet, here they were, calling him, asking for help. He walked over to the corner of the workshop and opened a dented steel locker. Inside, untouched for years, sat his old Navy-issued toolbox. The latches were stiff, the surface dulled from age, but everything inside was still in place. Torque wrenches, calipers, his custom socket set, and most importantly, a brass listening rod, the same one he had used on destroyers in his prime. He laid everything out on the workbench, inspecting each piece with the eye of a surgeon prepping for an operation. The tools weren't shiny or high-tech, but they were familiar, reliable, like him. Brandon changed into a clean set of coveralls, faded black with his last name stitched in white above the chest. He shaved, something he hadn't bothered with in weeks. Then he stood before a mirror and stared at the man looking back. Tired eyes, weathered skin, but a steady gaze. His reflection didn't show fear, just purpose. The next morning, a black government SUV pulled up outside the workshop. Brandon climbed in without a word, toolbox on his lap, his mind already turning over the possibilities of what might be wrong with the engine. Not in terms of failure, but what they'd missed. 2 hours later, the SUV passed through the towering gates of Naval Base Kitsap. Brandon watched silently as the massive gray forms of destroyers and carriers rose in the distance like metal giants. The scent of salt and fuel hit him like a memory. They pulled up to a security checkpoint. 2 young sailors stood guard, both barely in their 20s. One of them approached the window. "Name?" "Brandon Clark," he said. The sailor squinted at the name, then checked a digital pad. "Clearance confirmed," the young man said, then looked up at Brandon with a mix of confusion and doubt. "You sure you're supposed to be here, sir?" Brandon didn't reply. He simply opened the door, stepped out, and started walking across the damp asphalt, toolbox in hand. As he moved through the base, other sailors and engineers turned to glance at him. Some whispered. Others barely concealed their smirk. To them, he was just some old guy carrying rusty tools, an antique in a world of digital diagnostics and AI-driven analysis. "Who's that?" one technician asked. "Some retired vet. Supposed to be a turbine whisperer or something," another chuckled. "Yeah, okay." Inside the intermediate maintenance facility, Admiral Lawson was waiting. He stood near a raised platform where the LM-2500 gas turbine sat, disassembled, sterile, surrounded by blinking monitors and frustrated engineers. Brandon stepped through the door, his boots echoing against the polished floor. No fanfare, no salute, just quiet stares. Lawson approached with a nod. "Thanks for coming, Clark." Brandon nodded back, but his eyes were already scanning the room. "Where's the engine?" "Right there," Lawson said, gesturing to the turbine, its silver casing gleaming under bright lights. 5 teams. No answers. Brandon set his toolbox down and walked slowly toward the engine. Every movement was deliberate, every glance practiced. The lead engineer, Chief Watkins, stepped forward. Younger, confident, and clearly unimpressed. "You must be Mr. Clark," he said, arms crossed. "I've reviewed your file. It's interesting." Brandon raised an eyebrow. "That so?" Watkins smirked. "We've already replaced the filters, reseated the control modules, checked the turbine bearings, and run every diagnostic we've got. There's nothing left for you to do." Brandon looked at the engine, then at Watkins. "We'll see." Around him, the room buzzed with skepticism. Eyes rolled. Whispered jokes passed behind hands. But Brandon didn't respond. He just stepped up to the turbine, laid one hand gently on the metal casing, and closed his eyes. And in that moment, surrounded by doubt, Brandon Clark was home. The intermediate maintenance facility at Kitsap stretched like an aircraft hangar carved out of steel and concrete. Inside, the air hummed with the subtle tension of industry, a blend of electrical buzz, clicking tools, and the soft growl of motors running in test cycles. Overhead cranes slid slowly along their tracks, carrying heavy components with the grace of practiced machinery. Fluorescent lights hung high above, casting a cold blue glare on the polished concrete floor, where yellow hazard lines divided the space with geometric precision. Workstations were arranged in perfect rows, each outfitted with mounted terminals, tool caddies, and digital monitors displaying live diagnostic. Massive engine blocks sat on steel stands, their insides exposed like the rib cages of industrial giants. Nearby, glass-walled inspection rooms held engineers in clean lab coats, poring over thermal imaging scans and vibration charts. And in the center of it all, surrounded by warning tape, floodlights, and a semicircle of skeptical engineers, stood the LM-2500 gas turbine, removed from the USS Arleigh Burke like a wounded heart waiting for surgery. Brandon Clark stood quietly before it, his toolbox at his side. His presence had turned the usual background noise into a sort of stage whisper. Engineers glanced over their shoulders as they moved, speaking softer now, their expressions a mixture of confusion and disbelief. The man standing in front of their most advanced propulsion unit looked more like a retired dock worker than someone qualified to diagnose naval machinery. Admiral Lawson stood nearby, arms folded. "Chief Watkins, give him the run-through," Lawson ordered. Watkins, stiff-backed, clipped tone, stepped forward, tablet in hand. "We've already run 4 full thermal cycles on the turbine," he said. "Replaced the fuel filters, swapped in a secondary valve module, recalibrated the combustion sensors, ran full diagnostics on the control system and the main shaft. Everything reads clean." "Pressure drop?" Brandon asked, eyes still on the engine. "Consistent after 90 seconds at load. Always the same." "Vibration tests?" "Nominal, nothing outside tolerance." Brandon tilted his head. "Define nominal." Watkins narrowed his eyes. "Within the standard margin of fluctuation as defined by operational protocols. We log minor spikes at high RPM but nothing that would trigger an alert." Brandon finally looked him in the eye. "You ever try listening to it?" Watkins blinked. "Listening? Not through software," Brandon clarified. "With your ear." Several engineers chuckled quietly. Someone whispered, "This guy's a fossil." Brandon said nothing. Instead, he opened his toolbox, reached inside, and pulled out a worn brass rod, its ends smoothed from decades of use. The smirks widened. "You've got to be kidding," one of the younger techs muttered. "This is a Navy facility, not a tractor garage," another said under his breath. Brandon ignored them. He walked around the turbine slowly, running his hand across the outer housing like a piano tuner searching for the right note. He paused near the second stage compression chamber, where the housing was slightly discolored from heat. There, he pressed one end of the brass rod to the casing and brought the other end to his ear. Silence fell over the bay. Brandon closed his eyes. He shifted the rod slightly, waited, then moved again. Each time he adjusted his posture, like a stethoscope pressed against a heartbeat. The engineers watched in stunned silence, some curious, others visibly annoyed. Watkins stepped forward again. "Mr. Clark, with all due respect, we have ultrasonic sensors and harmonic monitors for this exact purpose." Brandon didn't move. "And yet here I am." Another beat of silence. Then Brandon stood upright, lowered the rod, and said, "Power it up." "What?" "The engine. Power it. Run idle for 45 seconds. Then full throttle for 30. Watkins looked stunned. "We can't run a faulty turbine at full throttle. That violates multiple safety protocols." Brandon turned to Admiral Lawson. "We're not going to hear the issue at idle. And your diagnostics clearly aren't seeing it either. If I'm going to solve this, I need to hear it scream." Lawson looked at Watkins. "Do it." Watkins hesitated, then gave a reluctant nod. 45 seconds idle, 30 full power. Technicians scrambled into position. Safety barriers were raised. One engineer keyed in commands on the main console. Lights turned red. A digital countdown began flashing on the side screen. Brandon took his position next to the turbine and placed the brass rod against the casing again. He didn't wear ear protection. He didn't consult a monitor. He simply closed his eyes. The turbine roared to life, the facility shaking with the sound. At first, the noise was uniform, controlled. The idle sequence kicked in cleanly. Engineers watched their screens, noting nothing unusual. Then came the shift. Full throttle. The turbine surged, a deep, rising wail filling the facility. Brandon didn't flinch. He pressed the rod tighter, lips pressed into a thin line. 6 seconds passed. 7. Then, "Shut it down," he barked, stepping back. The engine powered down in sequence. The noise faded, replaced once again by the soft background hum of the bass. Brandon set the rod down and turned to the team. "It's not salt damage," he said. "And it's not pressure loss from the valves. You've got a rotor misalignment." Watkins blinked. "What?" "At peak RPM," Brandon explained, "your central shaft is drifting, likely less than a millimeter, but enough to cause an out-of-phase harmonic vibration. It doesn't show up on static diagnostics, but it builds. The turbine's producing a frequency offset that amplifies in the last few seconds at full power. That's what's triggering the failure." No one spoke. "Check your axial and radial clearances," Brandon continued. "Use a laser. You'll find the shaft's off-center." Watkins looked at the screen, then at his team. "That doesn't match any of our alerts." "Because you're not listening," Brandon said quietly. "You're just watching." He grabbed his toolbox and began walking away. "Where are you going?" Lawson called. Brandon didn't turn around. "You don't need me anymore. You just need to trust the sound." Around him, the engineers remained frozen, caught between disbelief and something they hadn't felt in years: respect. The engine bay was quiet now, eerily quiet. The roar of the LM-2500 had faded, replaced by the faint buzz of overhead lights and the low murmur of technicians huddled in circles. But beneath that stillness, something had shifted. Not in the machinery, but in the air between the men. Chief Engineer Watkins stood at his console, eyes glued to a real-time diagnostic graph. For the past hour, his team had followed Brandon's instructions to the letter. They had powered the turbine again, hot and under load. They had deployed laser shaft alignment tools, something not typically used this far along in post-diagnostic inspections. They had measured the axial and radial clearances between the rotor and the casing with microscopic precision. And then, the data lit up the screen like fireworks. 0.83 millimeters off-center, One of the engineers whispered, mouth half open. That's significant. Watkins ran a hand through his graying hair, staring at the figures as if they had betrayed him. It wasn't the filters. It wasn't fuel flow. It wasn't the turbine blades. No, said another. It was harmonic resonance. Exactly what he said. The rotor shaft, when spinning at peak RPM, had been shifting ever so slightly, causing microvibrations that threw off the entire balance of the engine's internal rhythm. Over time, that tiny misalignment had created a cascading failure effect, one the automated diagnostics couldn't catch because the thresholds weren't tuned for patterned resonance. Only a human ear, trained to hear not just sound but tone, could have detected it. That evening, as the sun dipped below the jagged horizon of cranes and steel towers, Brandon was back in his workshop, pouring diesel into an old carburetor tray. His coveralls were speckled with oil again, and the brass rod had returned to its usual spot on the pegboard. Then, his phone rang. "Clark," he said simply. The voice on the other end was softer than before. "Mr. Clark, it's Watkins." Brandon said nothing. We ran the tests again," Watkins continued. "Laser alignment. Full throttle. The shaft was off-center, just like you said. The resonance pattern matched. We missed it, but you didn't." Still silence. "I just wanted to say," Watkins paused. "You were right. I was wrong. And I'm sorry for doubting you." Brandon allowed the moment to stretch before replying. "Machines talk. You just forgot how to listen." Watkins gave a quiet laugh on the other end. "We've rescheduled the deployment. The ship's cleared. She leaves on time, thanks to you." Brandon hung up without another word. The next morning, a black military helicopter descended onto the old dock behind Brandon's shed, the rotor wash sending sand and seaweed flying. A young Navy lieutenant stepped out, crisp uniform flapping in the wind. "Mr. Clark," he said, "Admiral Lawson requests your presence back at the base." Brandon wiped his hands on a towel, grabbed his toolbox as if it were just another day, and followed the officer onto the chopper. At Naval Base Kitsap, a small group of officers waited near the administrative wing. Admiral Lawson stood at the front, flanked by Watkins and several other high-ranking engineers. But this time, there were no skeptical glances, no smirks, just silence and respect. As Brandon stepped onto the concrete platform, Lawson approached, hand extended. "Brandon Clark," he said. "I was right to call you. We ran the full report. Your diagnosis saved the mission. But more than that, you proved something we should have seen long ago." Lawson reached into his jacket and produced a white envelope, sealed with an official Navy stamp. "This is your consulting compensation," he said, "but more importantly, this is a formal apology. The Navy has reviewed the records related to your forced retirement. Based on archive data, it's clear the fault in that engine 20 years ago was a design flaw, not operator error. The failure wasn't yours." Brandon took the envelope without looking inside. "We can't undo what happened," Lawson added, voice low, "but we can recognize what we missed. And honor the service you gave." Beside him, Watkins stepped forward. His tone was no longer condescending, but humble, almost reverent. "Mr. Clark," he said, "I've studied that engine for years. Thought I knew everything there was to know. But today you reminded me that some things can't be learned from screens or code. You taught me something I didn't know I still needed to learn." Brandon gave him a long, steady look. "You're an engineer," he said. "Act like one. Never stop listening." Watkins nodded deeply. Later that afternoon, Brandon walked the long asphalt path leading to Pier 3, where the USS Arleigh Burke stood tall and gleaming. Her hull had been freshly painted. Her crew, preparing for deployment, moved efficiently across the deck. Brandon stopped at the base of the gangway. He didn't ask to board. Didn't need to. He simply stood there, staring up at the ship that had once ruined his career, and now, perhaps, had helped restore his name. There was no ceremony. No speech. Just the sound of the wind through the flag lines and the distant boom of cargo crates settling on metal deck. But in that moment the ship felt different. Not as a symbol of loss, but as a monument to resilience. He had built its heart. They had blamed him for its failure. And now it was his hands, steady, calloused, and forgotten by time, that had brought it back to life. A junior officer passed him, paused, and gave a quick salute. "Sir," he said with quiet admiration. Brandon simply nodded. Then, with the envelope in one pocket and his dignity in the other, he turned and walked back down the pier. The sun reflected off the destroyer's hull, shimmering against the waves. Somewhere deep within, the LM 2500 engine purred like a lion, aligned, balanced, and ready for battle. The rotor blades of the Navy helicopter chopped through the thick ocean air, sending gusts of wind across the pier. Brandon Clark stood on the helipad just beyond the administrative wing, his toolbox resting at his side like it always had, worn, dented, loyal. This time, though, he wasn't alone. A line of officers stood in quiet formation nearby. There were no speeches, no brass bands, no press photographers snapping pictures. Just men and women in uniform, standing still, watching him, not out of protocol, but out of genuine respect. A young ensign stepped forward and raised his hand in a crisp salute. Others followed. Engineers, technicians, even Chief Watkins, standing at the end of the line with his hands behind his back, gave a slow, deliberate nod. Brandon returned the gesture with a simple look, no smile, no flourish. He wasn't a man who needed noise. For him, silence always said more. Admiral Lawson approached as the helicopter's engine began to whine louder in preparation for takeoff. "Clark," he said, extending his hand. "We can't thank you enough." Brandon shook it firmly. "You didn't have to." "I did," Lawson said. "We all did. And I should have done it a long time ago." A pause passed between them. The wind from the chopper kicked up again, tugging at their jackets. "We've started a full review," Lawson continued. "Not just of your case, but of how we've handled everyone like it. Your story, it reminded us that experience isn't obsolete. That wisdom has a sound of its own." Brandon looked away for a moment, his gaze landing on the distant silhouette of the USS Arleigh Burke, docked just beyond the fuel tanks and loading cranes. Her engines were live, humming gently, preparing for departure. "She's ready," he said. "She is," Lawson replied. "Because of you." Brandon nodded, picked up his toolbox, and walked toward the waiting helicopter. Just before boarding, he turned back one last time. "Take care of her," he said, almost too softly to hear. "We will," Lawson answered. Inside the helicopter, Brandon buckled into the rear seat by the window. The cabin was sparse, just 2 seats, a radio panel, and a row of cargo restraints. As the chopper lifted off the ground, the entire base grew smaller beneath him. From the sky, the destroyer looked like a blade of steel slicing through the blue waters, its shape steady, proud, unwavering. He watched in silence. There was no ceremony as it pushed off from the pier, just the efficient motion of a ship returning to duty, its crew moving with purpose. But to Brandon, it meant everything. That ship had carried his greatest work and his worst injustice. And now, as it glided out to sea once again, it carried something else. Closure. No headlines would be written. No medals would be awarded. But he didn't need those. This moment, quiet, wind-tossed, distant, was enough. The coastline faded into the haze of ocean fog as the helicopter banked away. Brandon leaned back in his seat, toolbox between his feet, eyes on the horizon. He didn't smile. He didn't cry. He just watched. And in that stillness, with the sea below and the destroyer now a speck in the waves, Brandon Clark found what had eluded him for decades. Not revenge. Not even redemption. Just peace. A legacy restored, not in records or ceremonies, but in action. In the roar of an engine brought back to life. In the silence of a farewell earned the hard way. As the clouds drifted past the window and the hum of the rotor faded into rhythm, Brandon closed his eyes. the mission continued. And so did he.